Welcome. I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. My name is Barbara Kelman on behalf of Brookline citizens in support of impeachment and on behalf of co-petitioners Alex Bourne-File and Lisa Kolarek. Alex and Lisa really led the charge to collect the 429 Brookline signatures we needed to make this happen and to put this before our town meeting. That meeting is coming up, starts May 23rd, but this resolution will be on May 25th. So just a couple of housekeeping things. If you don't know who your town meeting members are, if you can pick up one of these as you leave, and figure that out. And if you support what this effort is about after hearing our speakers, please call your town meeting members or email them. If you're interested in speaking at town meeting, please come and see me or Alex after this evening, because we're trying to coordinate people interested in speaking so that we can be most effective and efficient in doing that. So what's being brought to town meeting is a resolution in support of congressional investigation regarding the impeachment of Trump, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. Can you please hold your questions till they're done speaking? There will be time, plenty of time for questions at the end. And so let me introduce these gentlemen. Ben Clements, who will speak first, is board chair of Free Speech for People and a founding partner of the Boston law firm of Clements and Pinot, and a former federal prosecutor and chief legal counsel to Governor Patrick. He's a member of the advisory committee to the Boston Lawyers chapter of the American Constitution Society, keyword Constitution, and has been served as chair of the Massachusetts Governor's Task Force on Public Integrity, graduated from Dartmouth College and Cornell Law School. Ron Fein, who will speak after Ben, is the legal director of Free Speech for People. He previously served as assistant regional counsel at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the New England office, where he received a National Gold Medal for exceptional service. He clerked for both the U.S. Court of Appeals, First Circuit, as well as for the Honorable Douglas Woodlock here in Massachusetts District Court. Graduated with the Order of the Coif from Stanford Law School and from Harvard College. So welcome to Ben and Ron. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, everybody, for being here, including my law school roommate who just walked in. In addition to Barbara, I really want to give another hand to Lisa and Alex for all the work on this resolution, and to Penny. Penny over here has done so much work to make this event happen tonight, and I know lots of other people did as well, including, I should say, my dearly beloved Cindy, my wife, and to all those who helped out getting the word out to get all the people here. Thank you so much. As Barbara said, I am the board chair of Free Speech for People. Free Speech for People was started in 2010, January 2010, the day that the United States Supreme Court handed down their now infamous decision in the Citizens United case. And our organization was formed in response to that decision to push back on that decision. And our mission over these last 7 years has been to fight the overwhelming, corrosive, and corrupting influence of wealth and corporations over our democracy and over our government. We've been doing that through litigation, we've been doing that through legal advocacy, and we have been pushing for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision. We are a national, non-partisan organization. We don't support political candidates, we don't oppose political candidates. But when Donald Trump announced that he was going to refuse to divest of his ownership of the Trump Organization and to disentangle himself from the web of loans and business arrangements that he has with foreign governments throughout the world, despite being warned repeatedly that he needed to do this to comply with the Constitution, we realized that we were going to be faced with the most money-dominated, corrupt presidency in our history. And so we decided as an organization that if we were going to be true to our mission, our anti-corruption mission and our pro-democracy mission, we could not stand on the sidelines as the most corrupt presidency proceeded. And so on Inauguration Day, together with our partner Roots Action, we launched a campaign and a website, impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org, calling on Congress to begin an impeachment investigation as to whether the president should be impeached for his blatant and defiant violations of the Constitution's anti-corruption clauses that you've now all heard of, the emoluments clauses. A lot's happened since that day. Our worst fears have been realized, and then some, by many magnitudes, I would say. The good news is that also in that time, I was expecting to be saying to you that we have had almost 1 million people sign our petition calling for an impeachment investigation. But I have to revise that. As of this afternoon, we have more than 1 million signatures calling for an impeachment investigation. And I think the man in the Oval Office over the course of the last 2 weeks has helped us along with a big bump this week in signatures. But so has Congressman Al Green of Texas, who many of you may know gave a stirring speech on the floor of the House today, calling for impeachment, and actually referencing free speech for people and calling on people to sign our petition. So we're very thankful for Congressman Green's efforts. And another thing that has happened over the course of these 100+ days is the movement has grown, it has spread. The 1 million+ signatures reflect what is getting to be a majority of all Americans that believe this man must be impeached. And 9 cities and towns across the country have filed resolutions calling for an impeachment investigation. The great town of Brookline took one step closer to doing so last night when the selectmen voted unanimously to recommend the resolution to town meeting. So we're counting on that soon from Brookline. So we've come a long way, but there's a lot of work left to be done. And to that end, we're going to talk a little bit about the basis for impeachment. Ron Fein is going to talk to you about how the impeachment process works, and he's going to talk to you about the emoluments clause violations. And then I will talk to you a little bit more about the newest grounds which we have added to our petition and our recommended resolution, which, as you can imagine, is obstruction of justice. So we'll be talking about all those things. Let me turn it now over to Ron.
Thank you, and thanks. I really am in awe of the organizers because, as we've learned, it is really hard to put together an event like this, to gather 429 signatures, to bring people out. So I'm in awe of the organizers and all of you who have come out on an increasingly hot summer weather night to hear about impeachment. So let me first say that our website at impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org is a petition, but it's more than a petition. We have a lot of resources up there, information about the legal case for impeachment. We update it frequently, and I would encourage all of you to sign up if you haven't already. And a key thing, I know all of you know this, but maybe some of your relatives don't, is that with a web address, you have to get it exactly right. It's impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org. If you say, I went to impeachtrump.com and I didn't find it, you're at a different website or no website at all. So if you go to impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org, you will also find some swag that you can get, which I cannot help but show some samples here. I can't sell merch here, but bumper stickers, t-shirts, car magnets, yard signs, and a significant portion of the proceeds goes to fund this campaign. So before I start getting into the details of the emoluments clauses and talking about office developments in Istanbul and Manila, I wanted to first reflect on what a crazy 10 days this has been. So today is Wednesday, May 17th, and I want to rewind exactly 10 days to Monday, I guess the 7th. That was the day that we learned that President Obama had warned Trump about Michael Flynn being potentially compromised by the Russians. That was Monday. On Tuesday, Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, supposedly on the recommendation of Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. On Wednesday, Trump met with the Russian foreign minister, and we later learned the Russian ambassador didn't allow any American media into it, but allowed Russian state media into the Oval Office, something that had never been done before, and God knows what they photographed, but it was only through Russian state media that we learned that the Russian ambassador was even in the room. That was last Wednesday. On Thursday, Trump said actually he was planning to fire Comey no matter what the Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein's memo had said. He was going to do it anyway because he thought that the Russia investigation was a made-up story, so that's why he decided to fire the FBI director. That's 4 days. On Friday, Trump announced on Twitter that he might have tapes of his conversations with Comey. On Saturday, potential FBI candidates were paraded in front of cameras. On Sunday, Trump played golf. On Monday, it was revealed that Trump had actually shared code word classified intelligence with the Russians, where he had given up very detailed and sensitive information about our understanding of what ISIS is doing, to the horror of some people who were in the room with him. On Tuesday, we learned that what he had actually given up was that the Israelis had gotten a spy inside ISIS, which I cannot imagine how long it took them to do that, how many people must have tried and died to reach those ranks. And finally, they got one in, and then Trump blithely told the Russians, who I'm sure by now Iran and many other unfriendly countries know about this, certainly ISIS. That person is probably dead by now. We also learned on Tuesday, today's Wednesday, right? Yeah, this is yesterday. We also learned that FBI Director Comey took notes at a memo immediately after his meeting with Trump, in which Trump asked him to lay off General Flynn in the investigation. Another story that happened Tuesday that I can't say that the media buried it because it was certainly reported, but it just got overwhelmed with everything else going on. Turkish security forces attacked 24 people on a public park in broad daylight in Washington, D.C. Look it up. It was covered in the New York Times, covered on CNN, just with everything else going on. Turkish security forces attacked anti-Turkish government protesters. The DC police intervened, but 9 people had to be hospitalized from injuries from the Turkish security forces, presidential bodyguards. Trump was posing for pictures with the president of Turkey in the White House. And today's Wednesday. Today, Representative Green became the first member of Congress to speak on the House floor in favor of impeachment, and people gathered in Brookline, Massachusetts to make history. All right, now we're going to get into some nitty-gritty. So I'm going to first talk about what is impeachment and how does it work, and then we're going to get into the really hardcore stuff about emoluments. So impeachment is provided in the Constitution that the president or the vice president can be removed from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's the phrase other high crimes and misdemeanors that's probably most relevant here, although I wouldn't rule out bribery. When we hear the word misdemeanors in modern English, we tend to think of minor criminal offenses. But the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors is actually a set phrase that the framers of the Constitution took from the practice of the British Parliament. And while it does not have a precise definition, the inherited understanding of it, both from British practice and over the past 230 years of our own Constitution, has been that it means serious offenses against the public trust, abuses of public authority, grave abuses of office. It's certainly not the case that any violation of the law or even the Constitution is necessarily a high crime or misdemeanor. There can be things that are illegal but not high crimes or misdemeanors. Conversely, there are some things that can be impeachable high crimes or misdemeanors that wouldn't actually violate a specific criminal law. That becomes particularly important when you start talking about the president, because some of the way that some of these laws are phrased, in some cases it doesn't apply, the statutes don't apply as obviously to the president, but it can still be a high crime or misdemeanor. So then the question is, how does impeachment take place? So the Constitution provides that the House must first pass articles of impeachment, and that's by a vote of one more than a majority, so just a little over a half. When the House of Representatives does this, it goes to the Senate, and there's a trial. The Senate basically acts as a jury, and it must convict by a 2/3 margin. So 67 senators required to convict, given that we have 50 states now. Now that is a high bar. Over the course of our history, we have had, I believe, 15 full-fledged impeachment proceedings of judges, federal judges, and 3, basically, of presidents. And the way that these have turned out with the judges is about half of them were convicted. Of the other half who were not convicted, about a quarter were acquitted, and then the other quarter resigned as a result of this investigation. And that's actually a pattern that's important to know when we talk about the presidents who were impeached. Because of the 3 presidents who underwent impeachment proceedings, none of them were convicted through the Senate. So President Andrew Johnson was impeached but not convicted by the Senate. President Bill Clinton was impeached but not convicted by the Senate. So you will sometimes hear commentators say, well, no president has ever been impeached, forgetting about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not actually impeached by the House. What happened was the House, in all successful impeachment proceedings, begins with an investigation. And in the modern era, that's done through the Judiciary Committee. And the Judiciary Committee would be authorized by the House to conduct an investigation into whether to bring articles of impeachment. And then if this Judiciary Committee recommends articles of impeachment, then the full House votes on them. And what happened with Richard Nixon was the House Judiciary Committee recommended articles of impeachment. He saw the writing on the wall, and he resigned. We consider that an acceptable outcome of this process. So that's the procedure, and I want to talk now about some of the details of the emoluments violations and why they are impeachable. So emoluments is a technical term. We don't use it in regular English. These provisions have to do with corruption. And the Foreign Emoluments Clause and the Domestic Emoluments Clause are slightly different, and it's important to know the difference. I think a lot of the conversation in the media has only focused on the Foreign Emoluments Clause, but the Domestic Emoluments Clause is important as well. So to back up, I should say that Trump has about 500 companies associated with him. Most of his business is done through these companies. They're spread over 25 countries. And it's, in some cases, enormously tangled and opaque business dealings. And we don't know everything. And part of that is because we don't have his tax returns, which would help a lot. But even if we did have his tax returns, there's still layers upon layers, shell companies, and very opaque financial transactions. So we don't have the full picture. What I'll talk to you about will be some of the egregious examples that we already know about without even having gone through a House investigation. The House Judiciary Committee, in an investigation, could subpoena records that would give more information than we have right now from publicly available sources. So the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution says that no person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. That's in Article 1 of the Constitution. I think it's always good to tell people where to find it. It's in Article 1, Section 9. And what this is designed to prevent is foreign governments from having a financial influence over the president. It's fairly simple. And this clause specifically says emoluments of any kind whatever. So that raises the question of what exactly is an emolument. And you will hear some people say emoluments only refers to titles or lands given by a foreign king, or maybe it only refers to checks that are specifically written, with something in the memo line that says, bribe or something like that. That's simply not the case. The framers of the Constitution were very worried about corruption and influence from foreign governments. The world has changed a lot, and the framers certainly had a lot of blind spots, but this is something that they saw pretty clearly, that foreign countries might try to influence our affairs. And one way they would do that would be by passing money to the president or to other government officials. And so emoluments includes, if you look at dictionaries from the 18th century, it includes opportunities for profit or advantage. It's written broadly, it's defined broadly, and if there was any doubt about it, the clause says of any kind whatever. So the foreign emoluments clause is really broad. So I could give you tons of examples of foreign emoluments that President Trump was receiving from the moment he was sworn in. I'm just going to give you a few. So the one that's most famous that everybody knows about is this hotel in Washington, D.C. And the hotel is sort of emolument central in a way. It was not doing too well until he was declared the winner of the election, at which point it's now a hot place for foreign government business. So foreign embassies have now been having events there. And in fact, one case, there's an allegation that the Trump organization pressured a foreign embassy to move an event from another hotel to the hotel in Washington, D.C. Now, Trump claims that he's going to donate the profits from foreign government events at this hotel to the Treasury. We don't know if that's ever going to happen. We don't know how he's defining the profits at his hotel. And at any rate, the clause doesn't say that they can take the emoluments, earn a little bit of interest on it, maybe make a good investment, short some stock, whatever, and then donate the profits. It says they cannot accept any emolument. But let's move on from the hotel, because I think people get wrapped up in that, and that's the one that he's even proposed some plan to deal with. The next thing is Trump Tower. Trump Tower in Manhattan has several foreign government tenants in it. There is the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, which is a state-owned bank, which is actually the largest tenant in Trump Tower, pays quite a bit of rent. We don't know the exact amount, but it's due to be renegotiated during his first term, first and hopefully foreshortened term. The government of Abu Dhabi, which is part of the United Arab Emirates, has a government office in Trump Tower. There may be others that we don't even know about. He also owes money. He has lines of credit from foreign state-owned banks. So the Bank of China has a line of credit to him of almost $1 billion. And they, of course, the interesting thing about an emolument is it's not only that they can give the money, it's also that they can take away the money. So that's a venue for influence over him. He also has a business partnership in the Philippines for Trump Tower Manila, where his business partner was named to be a special government official after Trump was elected. So now the Philippines' official special envoy to the United States is a real estate developer who's in partnership with Donald Trump for a tower in Manila. Another category of foreign emoluments are regulatory approvals. So when you try and build a project in another country, especially in some of these countries that he works in that have sometimes not very transparent permitting processes, there are a lot of approvals that can be granted or withheld. So for example, a golf course in Dubai opened in February, and that needed a ton of approvals. And that's the kind of example of how a government can extend him favors. He got 38 trademarks from the Chinese government in February and March that had been denied to him for over a decade. All of a sudden, now they're available. After he has a conversation with the Chinese premier about his policy towards Taiwan, now he gets his trademarks. The last thing I want to mention is Turkey, which has been in the news recently because of the violent attacks on protesters. Turkey is a U.S. ally, for sure. It's part of NATO, but it's a problematic relationship, for sure, and its president is descending into authoritarianism. And Trump has a pair of towers in Istanbul. One's a residential tower, the other is an office building called Trump Towers Istanbul. And he actually said, you can search this on the internet and you can listen to him saying in his voice on Breitbart News in an interview with, oddly enough, Steve Bannon, who was the radio host. Steve Bannon asked him, is Turkey a reliable partner? And Trump said, I have a little conflict of interest with Turkey because of his towers. Now you hear that. You hear him admitting that he has a little conflict of interest with Turkey. And then you hear that the Turkish security forces beat people on American soil for protesting the Turkish government, and that 24 hours after it happened, the State Department issued a 3-sentence statement of disapproval under the name of a spokesperson, but the president himself said nothing about it, about what is literally a foreign attack on U.S. soil. He couldn't rouse himself. And you wonder, does he have a little conflict of interest with Turkey or maybe a big conflict of interest in Turkey? That's the Foreign Emoluments Clause. The Domestic Emoluments Clause is much less discussed. This one applies only to the president. And what it says is that it's in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. It says the president shall, at stated times, receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected, and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them meaning any other state. So what that's saying is he gets a salary from Congress, and he also gets an expense account, but they're both capped. It's a certain amount of money. The salary right now, $400,000. No one's asking him to donate his $400,000. He can keep the $400,000. But he is not to take other money out of the federal treasury, nor is he to take money from state governments. So what's happening? First of all, at the state level, we know that he receives tons of tax subsidies and tax breaks from various state governments, and many of his businesses depend on these types of tax breaks in order to be financially viable. New York State, over the course of a decade, gave him almost $1 billion in tax breaks, and his company is planning to expand in 26 new cities since inauguration, all of which involve currying favor with state governments, which can exercise leverage over him through these tax breaks. Now, I'm not meaning to suggest that the governor of a state is going to go into the Oval Office and say, I need you to locate a facility here in my... It doesn't work that way. The development officials can talk to Eric or Don Jr. or Ivanka. The message will get there. The second thing is he's figured out novel ways to extract money from the public treasury. Now, these are not necessarily enormous quantities of money in terms of the overall federal budget, but they're so sordid that it really is almost disgusting. So first of all, the Secret Service is renting space in Trump Tower. Now, the Secret Service always establishes a command station near a president's primary non-White House residence, but it's usually not an expensive Midtown Manhattan real estate that the president himself owns and charges them whatever he wants for it. We don't know the exact amount because the Secret Service budget is classified. It's believed to be around $3.2 million. Second thing, and it's petty, but it's squalid. Every time he goes to Mar-a-Lago or the golf course in Virginia or the golf course in New Jersey, he doesn't travel alone. He brings with him advisors and Secret Service agents and other federal government employees. They have to sleep somewhere. They're going to buy some sodas. And if they are on official travel and they expense that, that's coming out of the federal treasury. Now, this is not the same concern that we often have with a lot of presidents. He's traveling too much, he's spending too much money. When a previous president, Bush or Obama, Democrat or Republican, travels and they spend a lot of money, you may feel, okay, they're spending too much of my money. But what Trump is doing, that none of them ever did before, is he's taking your money and putting it into his own pocket, because the money that's spent at Mar-a-Lago or the New Jersey Golf Club or the Virginia Golf Club all comes back to him. He basically has figured out a way to make federal travel be a profit center for himself. So these are the major categories that we have seen of his violations of the emoluments clauses. Now the question is, are these high crimes and misdemeanors? Because we said at the outset that not all violations of the Constitution are high crimes and misdemeanors. So I want to bring forth a couple of sources. First, let's talk about someone named Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. Gouverneur Morris is known as the penman of the Constitution because he is the one who actually wrote it. And in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he said, "No one would say that we ought to expose ourselves to the danger of seeing the president in foreign pay without being able to guard against it by displacing him." That was in the debate about the impeachment clause. Gouverneur Morris, the penman of the Constitution, used as an example of an impeachable offense the president in foreign pay. Another great example is the Virginia Ratifying Convention. When the Constitution was passed, it was basically passed in secret by this group in Philadelphia, but then it had to be ratified by the other 13 states. And there were some very spirited debates in rooms a lot like this, probably all male, but otherwise probably all white property-owning male, but not at all like this. The rooms were nothing like this. Even in Massachusetts, they were not like this. But they were spirited debates, and Edmund Jennings Randolph was a governor of Virginia. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. After the Constitution was ratified, George Washington appointed him to be the first Attorney General of the United States, and he later served as the second Secretary of State after Thomas Jefferson. So Edmund Jennings Randolph, I think you could say, is a guy that knew a little bit about the Constitution. And he was in a debate with George Mason, after whom George Mason University is named. George Mason was not a fan of the Constitution. He was advocating against it. He felt that the power of the presidency would be too great. And there were all sorts of dangers of how things could go wrong with this new Constitution. And so one of the things he mentioned was the possibility of influence over the president. And Edmund Jennings Randolph responded, and I'm quoting, he said, "There is another provision against the danger of the president receiving emoluments from foreign powers. If discovered, he may be impeached." If discovered, he may be impeached. We discovered this already before he even took office. We knew about these emoluments clause violations. He was warned. He was warned during the campaign. He was certainly warned between the election and the inauguration that he needed to take steps to resolve this situation by not having businesses that were taking money from foreign governments, taking money from federal and state governments. He chose not to do that. And if discovered, he may be impeached, and we hope he will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. We have more. There's much more, as you know. But who's ready to impeach already? I signaled out some of the people who particularly helped with the Brookline event and the Brookline resolution. So I was so focused on Brookline that I was remiss in neglecting to mention we have a very special guest here from Wellesley, who has been doing so much work on all of the resolutions and doing so much work to help our campaign all around. And she's on the board of Free Speech for People. So would you please welcome Marguerite Dorn. Thank you, Marguerite, for being here. I mentioned at the outset, Free Speech for People is a nonpartisan organization. And I want to come back to the point that this is a nonpartisan event. I know we're in Brookline. I know we got a lot of Democrats here. We might even have some progressives here. Maybe even people who admit to being liberals. But I do know we have at least one Republican here. I see Bruce right up there. But this is not a partisan campaign. This campaign is not about Democrats trying to undermine a Republican president. This is about patriotic Americans, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, independents, all of us stepping up and trying to fight back against one of the biggest threats to our constitutional democracy that we have ever faced. And those million signatures so far and growing represents, as I said, millions more all across this country who recognize the need to step up and do this. We are faced with a president who has absolutely no respect for, no understanding for our American values, our American traditions, or our Constitution. I think it is very safe to say, based on what we've seen in the last 12 days that Ron just walked you through, he holds our Constitution in contempt. He's contemptuous of the Constitution. And in the course of these last 12 days in particular, he has brought his contempt and his defiance for the rule of law, for the notion that nobody, not the president, not anybody else, is above the law. He has brought his contempt for that to a whole new level. So let me talk a little bit about what is a big piece of that, and that is his conduct in many pieces and together in an ugly mosaic that unquestionably amounts to obstruction of justice. A lot of people, the press is very quick to tell us, oh, don't rush to judgment. These things are complicated. You know, you heard Ron talk about emoluments. These are complicated. Obstruction of justice, very complicated. So we don't really know if he's done it. Well, it's actually not that complicated, particularly when you have the kind of blatant activity that we've seen from the president. But obstruction of justice is essentially any corrupt or improper effort to interfere with or influence a government proceeding, an official government proceeding, or an official government investigation. And the classic examples of the kinds of conduct that people can engage in to interfere with or obstruct an investigation are things like bribing a witness or an investigator or someone else who's involved in the investigation. Things like making false and misleading statements. Things like making threats or engaging in intimidating conduct. Now, the president has engaged in every single one of those types of things, and he's done it in multiple ways. And I am quite confident we probably just know about the very tip of the iceberg of all the ways that he's done it. But I'm going to try to catalog for you 7 specific acts, each of which individually is obstruction of justice and which together amount to an overwhelming pattern of obstruction of justice. And I'm going to go back a little bit before the last 10 or 12 days. Years ago, no, weeks ago, but it seems like years ago, the president did a very odd thing. He does a lot of odd things. But it did involve a tweet. You're not surprised to hear. But you'll recall he tweeted that President Obama had wiretapped him. Now, at the time, it just seemed like another one of his crazy, nutty, fallacious attacks on a political enemy. But now, it takes on a whole new meaning, because what was going on when he sent out that tweet? Well, Trump had learned that not only had the FBI been investigating the potential improper involvement of his campaign and him and his associates with Russia, but they had specifically been recording conversations of Russian agents that were under suspicion by the FBI, and that Donald Trump and some of his associates may have been caught up in those recorded conversations. So what does he do? He makes a preemptive charge that, you're going to hear about this, but you're going to hear it from me first, that Obama was illegally wiretapping me. Why does he do that? He does it to obstruct the investigation. He does it to distract the public from what's about to come out, but he also does it to send a message to the FBI, to Congress, to anyone that might investigate him, that if an investigation gets anywhere near him or his cronies, he will turn it on whoever he needs to. He'll turn it on the former president, he'll turn it on the FBI. And it also obstructed the investigation because you may recall reading about this. Suddenly, FBI agents, Justice Department officials, members of Congress, they weren't investigating minute to minute what was going on when the Russians were interfering with our election. They were trying to figure out if there was any basis for the president's claim that Barack Obama had illegally wiretapped him. So at least in that limited sense, he succeeded in interfering with the election. So that's number one. Number two, it gets a little more direct. He has a meeting with the director of the FBI, James Comey, and he essentially offers a bribe. He tells James Comey he wants his loyalty. It's in the context of a conversation about whether James Comey is going to be able to keep his job. And we've read something about it. I'm sure we're going to hear more about the exact nature of the conversation, but it seems quite clear from what we know so far, and frankly from what we know about Donald Trump, that he wasn't talking about loyalty to the Constitution. He wasn't talking about loyalty to the FBI. He wasn't talking about loyalty to anything or anyone other than Donald Trump. And in the context of that conversation, you don't have to be as smart and shrewd, and whatever else you think about him, James Comey is smart and shrewd, as James Comey to know that he is being delivered a message that you can have your job as long as you don't pursue any investigations that are going to get to me. Now, James Comey doesn't take the bribe, and he doesn't provide the loyalty commitment. But that was certainly a bribe tendered by the president. So that's number two. Number three, he essentially tries again a little later after his national security advisor, Flynn, is forced to resign when it's revealed that he's lied about his potentially unlawful dealings with the Russians. And so he goes to James Comey and he says, can you lay off of Flynn? Can you see your way to dropping this thing about Flynn? This is classic obstruction of justice. It doesn't get any clearer than that, particularly when we know that Flynn leads up the chain and eventually he's got to know it leads to Donald Trump. So that's one investigation he wants to make sure is going to stop. So that's number 3. Number 4, some time passes and it becomes clear that James Comey is not taking either of those deals. So what's left? You fire him. So that's number 4. You fire the person in charge of the investigation. Number 5, you have your Attorney General, who is supposed to have been recused from matters relating to the investigation that you were really focused on, and your Deputy Attorney General provide a pretense for the firing. And you essentially put them out there to say, he didn't fire him because of the Russian investigation, he fired him because of Hillary Clinton. Of course, all things lead back to Hillary Clinton. And then the next day, Trump tells us, no, that's not true, I fired him because of the Russian investigation. So I think that's 4 and 5 kind of blended together. Number 6, also in connection with the firing of James Comey, he makes a blatantly false statement. He delivers it to the FBI, to Mr. Comey in particular, but the message is clearly going to be made to the FBI, to Mr. Comey's successor, to Congress, again, to anyone who might think to investigate Donald Trump. And the false statement is him saying that James Comey has assured him 3 times that he, Donald Trump, is not under investigation. A preposterous statement, but again, a clear statement to anyone who hopes to succeed James Comey that if you want that job, you better follow that announcement that Donald Trump is not under investigation. Am I up to 6? Okay. Number 7. Intimidation, threats. After it becomes clear that the story's not going quite the way he thought it might, and James Comey might possibly have some information that would be unflattering to the president, he delivers a threat. He makes clear to James Comey that he better not think about disclosing the information he has on Donald Trump because he insinuates he's got James Comey on tape. So those are 7 extraordinary actions, and again, you hear a lot of hand-wringing in the press and among the not always boldest human beings that represent us in Congress that this is bad, it's troubling, but no, it's not really obstruction. I think the question is, could you imagine a stronger case of obstruction against a president of the United States? So let me turn to the question of, okay, this is obstruction. Is it impeachable? And it's actually, that one's perhaps even easier. The Republicans will tell you obstruction of justice is an impeachable offense. In fact, they impeached Bill Clinton for obstruction of justice. You'll recall that involved something some might consider less monumental than what we're faced here, which was lying about a consensual affair. But certainly the precedent is clearly established. Obstruction of justice is an impeachable offense. And of course, the other example, which perhaps fits better, as Ron pointed out, Richard Nixon, while not impeached, resigned only because he was facing inevitable impeachment in the House and conviction in the Senate. And what the impeachment was about was, again, obstruction of justice. So the historical record is quite clear. Obstruction of justice is an impeachable offense. And there's a couple important things to notice about the Nixon impeachment. One, the matter over which he was allegedly obstructed involved, as you'll recall, a break-in to the Democratic National Committee's office in D.C., a break-in that to this day remains mysterious of its purpose. But I think it's fair to say that it did not involve the kind of threat to our democracy that the potential of the Russian government interfering with our election and the Republican nominee candidate for president potentially participating in that. I think most people would agree that's a little more serious than a break-in. But the other very important point to remember about the Richard Nixon impeachment is Richard Nixon was not accused of participating in the break-in, of directing the break-in, of even knowing about the break-in when it happened. To this day, it has never been proven that Richard Nixon actually had anything to do with the break-in itself. The fact that he obstructed the investigation into the break-in was enough. So we do not need to wait for the evidence that Donald Trump in fact colluded with the Russians to interfere with our election. The obstruction of justice is enough. And one more point to bring home that this is indeed an impeachable offense. As Ron said, the Constitution does not specifically define high crimes and misdemeanors, but there were two types of high crimes and misdemeanors that the founders were so concerned about that they specifically called out: bribery and treason. And we've already talked about the bribe that the president offered to the FBI director. And while we may not be there yet, certainly the evidence grows by the day that Trump and his associates have engaged in treasonous conducts in their dealings with the Russians, perhaps as evidenced most recently by the disclosure of classified information to the Russian government. So Ron ran through the last 10 days, and I know this is true for many of you. It's been head-spinning what's been going on the last several weeks. And as I think about what he's done to desecrate our Constitution, to really smear our national reputation around the entire world. Now, I think about the invitations to murderous dictators to come to the White House, including, of course, the murderous dictator from the Philippines. And you might recall from Ron's remarks, Donald Trump has some interest in the Philippines. That's no doubt coincidental. I think about the firing of James Comey and all of the sordid conduct around that. I think about this disclosure to the Russians that at the most favorable interpretation of what happened there, favorable to the president, is that it was an opportunity for him to brag about the great intel he gets and impress a Russian ambassador almost as corrupt as he is. And when I think about all this stuff, I can't help, as painful as it is, but to think back to that Access Hollywood video that we all saw, that we all watched in horror and disgust, as he bragged about groping women, bragged about grabbing women wherever he wants, whenever he wants. And you remember what he said? He said, and they let you do it because you're a star. No one can do anything about it because you're a star. And I think for most of us, it was hard to even imagine, to think about a man like that being our president. But in darker moments when you did, you couldn't help but wonder, what would a man that depraved, that corrupt to the soul, do with the awesome, historically unprecedented power of the 21st century president? And we are beginning to get a taste of that, and it's not pretty. It is utterly horrifying. That man that we saw in the video is that man that we're seeing as president. Grab whatever you can, grab as much money as you can, grab it from the taxpayers, grab it from the Secret Service budget, grab your subsidies and your payments from state governments all over the country, grab your loans, grab your payments, grab your trademarks and more from foreign governments all over the world. Grab whatever you can for you, your daughter, your son-in-law, your business cronies. Grab it all because you're the president, and they let you do it. And there's nothing they can do about it. And if someone tries to get in your way, if a United States attorney for the Southern District of New York brings an investigation that gets a little too close to corruption in your administration, or an acting attorney general has the temerity to give you a warning that your national security advisor is actually a threat to national security because he has lied about his unlawful dealings with the Russians, or an FBI director is not willing to take your loyalty test and drop the investigation that's getting close to you, no problem. You fire them. You fire them because you're the president, and you can do whatever you want. There's nothing anyone can do about it. Well, it is time. It is time to show him, and it is time to wake up Congress and show Congress we can do something about this, we must do something about this, and we will do something about this. So let's go, Brookline. Let's get this resolution done. Let's get this impeachment done. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. We now have time for questions, and I hope we'll have some, I see hands up already. Penny is going to take the questions, and since it's a little hard to get the mic around, I think, Penny, what we're going to do is we're going to have people line up here. So if you wouldn't mind coming up and just sort of forming a line next to Penny, and we'll just take your questions one at a time.
First off, I want to say thank you for both of you. I was at the meeting. Absolutely fantastic. Very impactful. My fiance and I were at the climate march, and I don't know why I didn't post this, but I took a picture. I hung up an Impeach Trump right by the Capitol building, and I got a nice picture. And I was hanging up the Impeach Trump posters, and a lot of people were walking by and go, wow, what is this? I said, this is the movement. We're all on Facebook. We're all hopping mad, but this is the movement. This is for real. I saw you guys do the meeting in Cambridge, and you put it online. It was about an hour long, and I posted it on Facebook, and the same things I'm sure that everybody here is getting. Oh, what a waste of time, what a waste of time. Well, it's not a waste of time. Every spark creates a fire. It's the whole reason this guy is in office. Somebody came down his escalator, and now he's president. But three things. Number one, I just wanted to promote or say that I believe one of you is going to be on WGBH tomorrow. Is that true? Somebody's going to be on WGBH.
We will try to get there if we're supposed to be. But I will say we have a legal advisory board for the campaign to impeach Donald Trump now, and we've just added a number of members, including constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law School, and recently retired Supreme Judicial Court Justice Fernanda Duffley. And she was on WGBH yesterday with Jim Browdy, so that might be what you're thinking of.
He was being kind of condescending, but he was at least mentioning the cause. But I just wanted to say, yeah. First question, and then I have one more thing. What about all of the things that he's been saying? When people bring these things up, oh, well, I gave this business to my daughters. What about those things that he's saying in terms of, he seems to believe that whenever we bring up these emoluments, or when people say, what about your business dealings, this and that, he just shrugs them off and say, oh, well, I don't do that anymore. So we as the American people don't have any proof of that, though, but I'd kind of like to ask, what is it from your perspective that when he says those types of things, is he just really living in his own reality, or does he have proof that he's not getting any of these business dealings, that the Trump Towers and all of these things, he has nothing to do with them anymore? Because I don't think we have any proof that he doesn't. And final thing, one of you guys, both of you guys, you got to get on Bill Maher. You guys have to get on Bill Maher's HBO. I don't know how we can do it, but let's get a petition going, because Bill Maher would be very interested about what you guys have to say. And if one of you guys got on HBO, that'd be 30, 40 million people that would see this message. So thank you again.
Thank you. We very much appreciate those remarks, and you're 100% right about every spark in the fire, and that's what this is all about, and we got to do that. And it's a great question that we probably both have something to say about. You want to go first, Ron?
I can go first, sure. Yeah, this might be something that people might raise at town meetings, so it's worth knowing. What Trump did is he created something called the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. Now, as the word revocable implies, this is a trust that he can revoke at any time. And what is he signed over the businesses to this revocable trust, and the trustees are Don Jr. and one of his longtime senior executives. And all of his businesses are now officially owned by the trust. The trust produces all of its profits to Donald Trump, and he can revoke the trust at any point. The reason this is problematic is that when any other senior government official has had business holdings, they have basically two choices. One is to sell it, and then they can reinvest the money in something that's considered conflict-free, like treasury bonds. So, for example, Barack Obama, when he came into office, sold off any holdings that he had and bought treasury bonds. And that's considered fine. It's so widely held. Everybody has a stake in the success of the U.S. economy that treasury bonds are not considered conflicted. The other thing they can do is what's called a blind trust. And as the word blind implies, it means that it has to be something you don't know all the details of. So a blind trust would say you have an independent trustee, not your son or your longtime crony, but you have an independent trustee who takes assets and then manages them in a way that you don't even know what the trust holds. And that's what George W. Bush did. So he couldn't tell you, if you asked George W. Bush in 2006, like, what stocks do you own? He would have no idea because it was held in a blind trust. So even though it wasn't all just treasury bonds, there were specific assets, he didn't know what they were. So he couldn't take action to help particular industries or particular stocks, knowing that it would help his own personal bottom line. And every previous president has done one of these two things. Some previous presidents have been quite wealthy. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller was extremely wealthy. He found a way to get his assets out of this type of conflict. Other senior government officials, again, I know Ben said this is nonpartisan, so I really want to take a moment and praise Rex Tillerson. Okay, Rex Tillerson, CEO of Exxon until recently, sold all of his Exxon stock before becoming Secretary of State. He worked with the Office of Government Ethics to come up with a compliant arrangement where he would not be holding any type of conflicted asset while he is the Secretary of State of the United States. All previous administrations, Democrat or Republican, the cabinet secretaries have done this, the vice presidents have done this, the presidents have done this. Trump, his revocable trust is not a blind trust. He knows what's in it because it has the name Trump over the front door. So he knows everything that his company owns, and he may not be signing the checks going out. He may have given over day-to-day management to his children, but he's cashing the checks coming in. And that's what's important. It's not that the day-to-day management was our main concern. Our concern is that the money coming in goes to his pocket. And that's why what he did, no one thinks that is satisfactory. Not the leading constitutional law scholars, not the presidential ethics experts, both Democrat and Republican, and it does nothing to resolve the serious problems. Did you want to add something, Ben?
No, that's great.
Yeah, hi. I was also at the Newton event, and for the second time, you folks have been incredibly articulate and convincing, and thank you for that. My question is simply one of timing. What made the difference in the Nixon situation was when the Republicans started having doubts and started speaking with him, et cetera, and that's not really happening with Trump right now. And I think it's only, say, 2 or 3% of Trump voters are starting to regret their choice at this point. If this movement peaks too soon, I could see an investigation begun in the House, a party line vote, and then, and it would be very hard to bring up the issue of impeachment more than one time. So I just wonder if you have thoughts about the issue of maybe peaking too soon.
Well, it's a great question, and it certainly seems to reflect some of the thinking, perhaps, among Democrats in Congress that it's too soon. But, there was a lot of agitation about impeaching Nixon for a long time. And so the idea that if we, here in Brookline and in Cambridge and various other places around the country, push for impeachment, we have a great danger of getting a vote in 2 weeks that the Republicans voted down, it seems to me it's not a realistic danger. And in fact, it would be a good problem to have. So I think we need to be pushing. And the notion that we should wait for the Republicans, because that is the view of Nancy Pelosi, and that's the view that she is enforcing upon the Democratic members of the House, even though most of them, or many of them, I think, don't necessarily agree with it. The notion that we need to be quiet about impeachment because the Republicans will bring it up on their own, that's not typically how it works. If the Democrats aren't even talking about it, why should the Republicans? If Nancy Pelosi's saying he hasn't committed an impeachable offense. So in my view, it's not too early. I guess I would add to that, you know, at some point, we have to say, can we allow this to go on? And at some point, members of Congress, we can only hope, have to say, can we allow this to go on and still believe that we are a constitutional democracy? The comparisons to Richard Nixon, Ron and I made them, everybody makes them, but Richard Nixon was no Donald Trump. I mean, Richard Nixon was the patron saint of United States statesmanship compared to Donald Trump. So, I mean, we have, again, let's come back to Ron's 10-day list. There has not been a 10-day period like that in the history of the United States in terms of presidential misconduct. And so I think, from my perspective, we need to move in challenging this corruption in every way that we can, including pushing impeachment early and often. Do you want to add to that?
I didn't think you knew. At 6 o'clock tonight, Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, to be a special counsel. The Justice Department appointed him. And from what I'm seeing in Twitter, both Republicans and Democrats, even Rubio, are saying he's the right guy for the job. And supposedly Trump is going apoplectic in the White House.
Well, I had heard all of that before we took the stage tonight, except for the last part. But I guess I could have predicted that. Yeah, I think that that is a very good development. Bob Mueller, many of you probably have heard of him, is a very honorable law enforcement Republican who served here in Massachusetts as our U.S. attorney, who served as Deputy Attorney General in Washington, the position Rod Rosenstein now has, who served as head of the FBI for more than 10 years. He was sufficiently respected that Barack Obama asked him to stay on beyond the 10-year term. So I do think it's a very good choice, and it's not surprising that Trump would be apoplectic about it, because he certainly didn't want an independent counsel, and if there was going to be one, I'm sure he didn't want it to be Bob Mueller. Now, having said all that, these things move slowly, and the train wreck in Washington is moving quickly. And so I don't suggest we sit back and wait. I suggest we keep pushing, we keep fighting, and we keep demanding that Congress do their job.
So this is my question. What can we in Massachusetts, a state with 2 Democratic senators, and I know this is like nonpartisan, I'm just, it's the easiest way to say it, 2 Democratic senators, 2 fairly progressive Democratic senators, and a Democratic House delegation. What can I do in order to sort of push my representative, Mike Capuano? I actually live in Somerville. What can I do to basically make this happen?
So that's a great, great question. And you can and you should call Mike Capuano's office. You should visit Mike Capuano's office, and you should write to Mike Capuano's office. And in all of those communications, you should demand to know when Congressman Capuano will file the impeachment resolution calling for an investigation. And I would extend that suggestion to everybody here to push their congressman, because the idea that there's nothing for us to do because we have these wonderful liberal Democratic Congress people, it is true. We do have one of the best delegations that you could ask for in terms of dedicated committed public servants in those positions. But they are not stepping up. None of them did what the congressman from Houston did this morning. So let's tell Congressman Capuano we want to see that from him. And while we're on the subject of what can we do, as you've heard about, and many of you know about firsthand, many activists, wonderful citizens here in Brookline have been moving forward with a resolution that we are hoping will be passed by town meeting next week. That's been going on in other communities. There are people, including myself, involved in pushing a resolution in Newton, and there are a number of people here involved in pushing a resolution in Boston. And so if you are not yet one of those people, but you are from one of those communities, please feel free to check with me. Or actually, why don't I ask, is there anybody here that is organizing for any particular towns that would like to identify themselves?
I'm Terry Mason, and I'm organizing for Boston. Come to see me.
So anybody here from Boston that wants to coordinate with Terry, and I know Bruce Chafee is sitting right over there, is also involved in the Boston resolution. And Cindy is involved in Newton, as is Holly right here.
Can you give Newton hearing date?
Yes, Newton is scheduled to hear the resolution before the Programs and Services Committee on June 7th. So if you are from Newton, please call your council person and please try to make it over to City Hall on June 7th. Marguerite.
Could you call out Needham?
Yes, Needham. Who's here from Needham?
My name is Bart Rutzman, and I'll be starting the effort in Needham. Anybody want to get in touch with me? I'm right here.
All right, excellent.
I came today from Methuen, and I don't know if there's anything going on yet, but I definitely want to start something, so I'll reach out to whoever's here who can help me out to set me
Speak to
up.
Marguerite right in front of
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Brookline? These women in the front row, Lisa and Alex.
So in Brookline, here, I'll just say.
Barbara's going to talk to you a little bit about Brookline.
In Brookline, we got the approval of the endorsement effectively of the selectmen last night. And the resolution will be in front of town meeting on May 25th. And so again, if you can see Alex, when we're done here, or me, we're going to try to organize anybody who's interested in speaking. But that's where it stands.
Particularly for town meeting members who have priority speaking. But anybody else who would like to support that, have a talk to us as well, and we'll let you know, we'll send your email addresses and we'll let you know when to show up.
And I just want to add, first of all, to the gentleman from Somerville, what was your name?
Gabe Disler.
Gabe, you are now organizing Somerville City Council. I want to tell you what resources we at the National Impeach Donald Trump Now campaign can offer. So a lot of the hard part is gathering the people and the room and the videographer and the sound system and that aspect to have a meeting like this. But if you can put it together, Ben and I can come and we can take this show on the road. And if you go to impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org, you can get a lot of resources, a model local resolution, so you don't have to start from scratch in drafting yours. And we have frequently asked questions. You can contact, we actually have a digital organizing director. So if you email to, I think it's info@impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org, she can, once you have enough of an act together, email everybody who's signed up out of those million in a certain set of zip codes to say a meeting is going to be held at such and such a time. So we can't handle all of the legwork of setting up, and a lot of it does need to come from constituents. You know, the Somerville City Council wants to hear from people in Somerville, but we can help facilitate it.
And we do have an organizational meeting coming up in Newton on Monday for, among other things, impeachment matters generally. Cindy, can you say more about that?
We're just trying to organize anybody who's really fired up tonight. If you want to get involved in some grassroots advocacy and planning for these resolutions, we're having a meeting Monday night at the Grace Church in Newton. I have a sign-up sheet outside, or come see me and I can fill you in on details.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
One of the things I thought was so powerful, one of the things I thought was most powerful that you said was this is nonpartisan. And I've actually called the offices of Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy, saying to them, we need to reach out to Republicans because this is an American issue. And I think we're probably mostly Democrats here, I would guess, but I think it's very important to start dialogue. And one of the interns at, I think, Ed Markey's office said they were trying to make connections to their colleagues in the House because they are feeling very troubled, as they say, deeply troubled. And we have to get them to start to stand up. And I think that may be the key to getting this whole thing going. So I wondered how we could, and you could, somehow make a bridge, and almost like the Arabs and the Israelis, right? You know, the people can't talk to each other. And we could somehow start having dialogue and conversations that this is an American issue, it's a patriotic issue, it's not just a Democratic issue.
Great. Thank you for those comments and the question. You want to?
So one thing that I think is important is, as you've heard us talk here, we've focused entirely on nonpartisan American issues. You haven't heard us talk about, the health care bill or any number of issues that are very partisan and not tied to this effort. We're focusing it entirely on what is he doing that is a violation of the Constitution that's grounds for impeachment. And the way we talk about it, I've been talking about the framers of the Constitution, the original intent of the framers, using a language that I hope can appeal to people with a wide variety of political backgrounds, rather than framing it as a partisan type of attack. And sometimes you'll get pushback about like, well, he won the election and Hillary Clinton, blah, 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 blah. And my answer is, you're just changing the subject. We're talking right now about the President of the United States and the Constitution. The issue is not whether Hillary blah, 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 blah. She's not the President. The President of the United States is committing impeachable offenses. So here in Massachusetts, in your district, obviously if you have neighbors of whatever political persuasion, it's vitally important. We're talking about Mike Capuano and Joe Kennedy. They haven't come out in support of impeachment yet. So regardless of the political framework of Massachusetts as a whole, we need to organize here. In terms of if you have relatives who live in other states, other areas where the Republicans hold congressional seats, I think it's important to try and make this conversation not be about the things that divide us, but the things that unite us. And what holds America together other than these basic principles? We don't have common ancestry. Most of us are not indigenous people who have been here for 20,000 years. What binds us together are the basic principles in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. And Donald Trump is threatening all of that. And we all deserve better, Democrats, Republicans, and anything else.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The divisions in this country are sufficiently serious that in spite of all of the high crimes and misdemeanors and the kinds of things that you list, there's still about 35 to 40% of the people that support this president. So I'm asking you if we can look beyond impeachment and the current turmoil that will end someday. What is it that we need to understand? What is it we need to do to avoid a train wreck like this in the future? And is there something that your organization is looking to or is planning on or can envision that would help us avoid that?
Well, that is a great question, and we certainly look forward to the time that we have this train wreck behind us and we can think about preparing for the future. I guess I do want to comment on one part as it relates to where we are now, because I do think the media often overemphasizes that ongoing support for Trump, and I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that support is not particularly strong. the numbers have been in the 30% and dropping. That is incredibly low for a recently elected president of the United States. There's never been a recently elected president of the United States with those kind of poll numbers. And, you know, Richard Nixon won re-election in a landslide. 60+% of American people voted for him. And it was not that long after that that most Americans came together and recognized he had to be removed. So I just say all of that by way of saying, I think sooner or later, and we can only hope sooner, a very, very broad consensus of Americans are going to come together and recognize that whatever their differences on other issues, Donald Trump has to go. Now, that doesn't answer your harder question, which is how do we avoid it in the future? And I don't have an easy answer. I know none of us does, but I do think that at the risk of being called a pointy-headed elitist from Massachusetts, one of the biggest problems, maybe the biggest problem, is a huge percentage of Americans are grossly misinformed. And there are a lot of causes of that. One is our education system has been faltering in recent years, but in very recent years, the misinformation is not an accident. It's a deliberate scheme to misinform the people of the United States. And you know, we may have some Fox News fans here, but I don't think you can look at Fox News objectively and say they have not been misleading the American people for a long time. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think we need to find a way to get the American people to accept that facts and truth can't be dictated by which party they are in or which news station they watch. Those are objective things, and people need to be able to objectively figure out those facts. So it's not an easy battle, that's for sure, but I think that's a big part of it.
I want to add a few things to that, which is systemic reform of our democracy, because Donald Trump essentially hacked the system. And as Ben mentioned, Free Speech for People was founded to push back against the Citizens United decision, which unleashed the era of big money politics. And we've been focused entirely on impeachment, but I'd also encourage you to visit freespeechforpeople.org to learn about our broader work. I think there are a number of democracy reforms that need to take place, not all of which Free Speech for People is working on, but I'll discuss some of them. One is reforming money in politics. Second is voting rights. Obviously, we've seen a ton of voter suppression, and maybe that also includes modernizing voter registration and voting systems. Gerrymandering reform is a large part of it, and it may be time to revisit the Electoral College and how that works. So these are the types of things that got us into the mess we're in. I think what we need to do is first get out of this immediate crisis, and but in the meantime, Free Speech for People certainly continues to work on pushing back against Citizens United, and other organizations that we work with have been working on these broader democracy reform issues. And I think we need to not lose sight of that longer goal, that once we get Trump out of office, we're still going to have the same problems that enabled him to get in the first place until we fix those. Great.
I apologize, and it's not really a question that I'm asking. I just want to say something positive. I'm from Brazil. And, I never imagined in my life, in a million years, that I would give lessons in democracy to the United States. So I'm enjoying the opportunity.
We're all ears.
So the positive things is, we have impeached 2 presidents in the last 25 years. And it was an equal opportunity thing, right and left, for crimes that were much worse than anything Nixon thought of committing, but not nearly what Trump is doing. So I'm just saying that, there's hope. I didn't find my Brazil soccer team t-shirt when I came running here. It has 5 stars. It's because we impeached 2 presidents, we drove one to suicide, and we got another couple to resign. So it's gonna work out.
Well, actually, the original reason I was in line here was to add the item about Robert Mueller to your 10-day calendar of events of what's happening in Washington. But since that has already been done for me already, at first I thought, well, I didn't get all the details, so I just wanted to confirm that, but now it has already been confirmed. But while I'm here, I don't know if anybody here was at the town hall with Joe Kennedy. It was maybe a month or so ago, and somebody had actually asked him the question about impeachment, and as you folks stated earlier, like the other representatives from Massachusetts who were very committed and very good in a lot of ways, he was very evasive when that question was asked. So everybody here, get on his tail.
I just want to second that about Congressman Kennedy. Many of us have been on his tail on this issue. He needs to hear more. He needs to know that this is what his constituents want, and he answers to his constituents, not to Nancy Pelosi.
I just had an interesting situation Sunday. I was at Lord & Taylor in Boston with my granddaughter. She wanted to buy a dress. I'm walking around, all of a sudden, Make America Great was right in front of me with a full rack of Ivanka Trump dresses, all made in China. Interesting. I have a question. I don't get a chance to talk to lawyers very often. Yeah. Comey, when he was first brought up in front of the Intelligence Committee, had to answer several times, in view of an impending investigation, I can't answer that question. He's going in front of the Senate supposedly next week as a private citizen. Would you expect that he would answer the questions, take the Fifth Amendment? Can they force him to answer questions? Because he still would be under the umbrella of perjury. I mean, this is the opportunity. 7 of the points you brought up, Comey was involved with 4 of them. He is the key to the puzzle as of right now. And I'm not quite as paranoid as Richard Nixon, but I'm concerned about the personal safety of Mr. Comey right now.
Well, I don't think you have to be paranoid to have that last thought. I think it's absolutely a legitimate thought. Fortunately, Mr. Comey is very knowledgeable and experienced when it comes to law enforcement and those kinds of threats. So I hope and expect that he's doing things to take care of himself. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I may be wrong here, but I'm going to predict Jim Comey will not take the Fifth. But it is his right to take the Fifth. Anybody who is called to testify under oath, if they think answering it could somehow incriminate them, they can take the Fifth. But I don't expect that anything he said would likely incriminate him. And I don't expect, even if it would, that Jim Comey could ever bring himself to believe that he might say something that could incriminate him. So my prediction is he will testify, and there are certainly restrictions, as you noted, on things that an FBI director knows that are classified and that he may feel he is legally bound not to talk about. But I don't think there's much doubt that if they ask him, and they sure better ask him, about the conversations with the president, that he will answer.
2 quick ones. One issue, I kind of got some hope from the gentleman from Brazil, because they seem to be able to do multiple issues. We still gonna have a lot of bad apples in the barrel after he's gone. And every woman should realize we're going to first get stuck with keep them barefoot and pregnant Pence. And I don't think that's a very good idea. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because a lot of people have that concern, and it's a very legitimate concern. The short answer to it, I think, is it may not be a good idea unless you consider the alternative. And the alternative is to keep Pence and Trump. And when you put it that way, to me, it's not really a close call. I think if you want to look at it from a sort of pragmatic political sense, which one is more dangerous to democratic values, which one is more dangerous to the welfare of our country, I think the answer is Donald Trump, as abhorrent and offensive as I find Mike Pence's policies. But I'd also add to that I think we are in a situation where we need to take action to stop the blatant violations of the Constitution. We cannot pause to say, are we afraid of the political consequences if we enforce the Constitution? We are talking here about extremely serious violations. And for the people of America to essentially say that, you know what, if we think the vice president would be a bad alternative, we're going to look the other way, we're going to let those go, that would be a horrible, horrible precedent. I mean, we might as well throw out the Constitution if we're prepared to say that we're going to allow a president to day in and day out violate the Constitution because we're afraid to take it on.
I also just want to add, and this is preliminary, so we have not yet launched anything about this, but just consider in your mind that some of the other officials in the Trump administration may also be subject to impeachment. And in particular, I don't think that Pence or Sessions should be resting easy. Pence apparently was involved in planning the firing of Director Comey, and he was the head of the transition team, so he may have known a lot about what went on there that was questionable. Sessions also has his own issues with talking with Russian officials during the election. More needs to come out. We're not yet at a point where we can say that with confidence, but I think it is possible that as this all shakes out, there may be a broader clearing of house.
So just to put a light finish on that, or maybe a not so light finish, look forward to President Orrin Hatch. Sorry. But he will be substantially weakened, Orrin Hatch.
So I have just a quick question for you guys. Everybody knows follow the money, right? The money trail is deep, and you said 25 foreign countries, and that will take some time, but the money trail was there from day one, you know, the corrupt-looking investments and sales of properties of Donald Trump. Would you believe, like recently we heard on the news that they did subpoena some of the finances or some of the things that Flynn did. Do you feel there might be some subpoenas also into Trump's finances down the road, or are we too early thinking that way at this point?
Well, we're certainly not too early thinking that that should be going on. And we at Free Speech for People have been doing everything we can to try to make that go on. We have filed petitions with the Attorney General of New York to begin what's called a corporate charter revocation proceeding against the Trump Organization. That certainly has not happened publicly yet, but if it did, that would be a proceeding in which the Attorney General of New York would have the ability to subpoena and access Trump financial records. I think that, as people have noted, the appointment of Bob Mueller as a special counsel to investigate is likely to expand the opportunities for the FBI to pursue additional financial documents. So I think up to and including, for sure, Trump himself. Do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you.
Okay, so contemporaneous memos, what does that, how will those hold up? In court or in Congress when the Intelligence Committee is listening or reading Comey's contemporaneous memos? Do they have real weight?
So Lisa's question, in case anybody misses the reference, she's referring to the memos that James Comey apparently prepared of his conversations with the president. It sounds as if there are some detailed memos of the conversation in which the president demanded the loyalty oath in exchange for his job, and perhaps detailed memos about the conversations concerning dropping the Flynn investigation. And there are principles of evidentiary law that say notes that are taken immediately after something happens can be admitted into evidence in court under a hearsay exception. And so that's what the reference to contemporaneous notes or memos usually entails. The fact that they were taken contemporaneously certainly bolsters the weight that people will give them. As I said earlier, I suspect that Comey will end up testifying about these conversations, and so we won't just be relying on his contemporaneous memos. We will have what is generally considered the more reliable evidence of his statements themselves. But the fact that he took those notes will certainly bolster the credibility of his memory, that he doesn't have to just rely on his memory, he can rely on what he wrote down immediately after the conversation took place.
I'm in passionate agreement with all of this, that's why I'm here. And so I want to...
A repeat visitor.
I want to challenge you to defend against a devil's advocate. The first one is minor, and that is that a friend of mine said, oh, impeach, that's just sour grapes. People who are unhappy they lost. And the second is, and I think we know where we stand on that. You've made it a constitutional, not a political point. But I say that because it's difficult to make that clear without the details, so thank you for informing us, and let's continue that. Second one is this. As far as what Comey said and wrote and what Trump said, this is so far, at least to what I read, this is a lot of he said, she said. Trump said, give me your loyalty, and Comey wouldn't, and that sort of thing. And you make that one of your points. Trump says so many things that mean nothing. I can't trust a thing he says, and that is his best Teflon defense. Because in all this, he'll just say, well, I just said that. And when I told Lester Holt that it was because the Russian thing, well, I was just saying that because... And he can justifiably say that about anything he said, and frankly, I would believe him because nothing he says holds weight. So how do you grab this slippery watermelon how do you use his words against him when they mean nothing?
So that great question, Bruce. The first, was there a question about impeachment being sour grapes, or you're satisfied on that one?
It's a comment because we'll all get it, except the Republicans. Well, even the Republicans.
Yeah, but I would say on that issue, Donald Trump seems to have a misconception. He has a lot of misconceptions. But one of them, and it's in character with the rest of his misconceptions, is that he won the election. So he gets to do whatever he wants. The rules don't apply to him. And that's not how it works. In fact, there are a lot of rules, as Ron was explaining earlier. When you win the presidency of the United States, you got to do a lot of things you didn't have to do before. Like you got to sell your business and put it into a blind trust and do all kinds of things and be subject to scrutiny. So the notion that because he's president, he can do no wrong, that is absolutely foreign to our Constitution and to what our country's about. So that's the answer to the so-called sour grapes argument that anyone makes. The other thing about he says whatever comes to his mind, whether it's true or not, is not really a factor in his own mind. So anything he said, easy deniability as to whether he meant it as opposed to it was just thrown out. There's a couple things about that. One is, I think, a growing percentage of the country, that sort of excuse is wearing thin. And I think people are beginning to recognize he lies constantly, but he constantly says things to serve his own purposes. And so the fact that he's lying doesn't mean we can't take things that he says and pick out the kernel of truth in them. So when he tells you he had a conversation with James Comey about the investigation, And he says, and James Comey told me 3 times I'm not under investigation. And James Comey says, yes, we did have a conversation about the investigation, but that's not what I told him. The American people are starting to get that they can conclude from that, well, the part when Trump said he met with Comey to talk about the investigation, that was true. The part when he said, Comey told me 3 times you're not under investigation, that was false. So it's not easy to decipher it all, but I think we're starting to get experience with it, that the American people are starting to be able to do that. Another point I want to make is on the obstruction of justice, to make out the case of obstruction of justice, it doesn't matter so much which parts are true and which parts are false. The question is, did he say the things and were they intended to somehow obstruct the investigation? So when he said to James Comey, don't pursue this Flynn investigation, he can say now I didn't mean it. The point is he meant to communicate that message to Jim Comey. And so denying that that's what he meant is not much of a defense. It's not particularly credible.
But how do we impute that he meant it?
Well, my point is, in some ultra-subjective sense, whether he meant it or not doesn't matter. It's the message he communicated and what would a reasonable director of the FBI understand that message to be. And that, in a court of law, and I think in the court of public opinion, is enough to find him guilty of obstruction of justice without worrying about whether his mind is capable of knowing what he meant when he said those things. You want to add to that?
I think I'm going to say what's fundamentally the same thing Ben just said, but in a different way. So on the first point, I have heard this, oh, he won the election, so get over it. But if you take that logic, then no president can ever be impeached for anything because by definition they won the election or else they wouldn't be president. Richard Nixon won his election. Bill Clinton won his election. Both of them actually won their elections, all right? So the founders of the Constitution put in a provision about impeaching the president, assuming that the person who would be subject to impeachment was the president, meaning that he had won the election. So that logic goes a little bit too far. And it falls in line with Trump's, when you're a celebrity, they let you do it type of impunity. In terms of the issue of his mental state, there's certain words that matter and that are not just things that we say, but things that actually do actions when we say them. This is particularly true, of course, for the president of the United States, but in law there's this concept of performative speech, where certain words that you say actually have a legal effect. So if a judge in court says, I now sentence you to 10 years in prison, that's a prison sentence. That is the act of sentencing. If an officiant at a marriage says, I now pronounce you, man and wife, or wife and wife, or any other combination, that actually performs the act of making a marriage. And in the case of a threat by the President of the United States, or a line like, lay off the Flynn investigation, it doesn't matter if he had some secret, like, I'm saying this, but I don't mean it, and I've got backsies, and by saying those words, he delivered a message to the director of the FBI that calls for him to back off the investigation. And that message is what counts. So he can now say, like, oh, well, I didn't mean it. I mean, you could say anything. I declare war. We declare war in this country. Well, I didn't really mean we declare war. That logic just doesn't work for certain types of actions. And an attempt to intimidate or interfere with a federal law enforcement officer where he knew what he was saying, to say, like, well, I didn't subjectively mean it. I was just making it up. Well, you just made up your way into an obstruction of justice charge.
More questions?
Hi, I just wanted to say that a lot of my friends don't believe it's possible because of the Republican majority, and I just say to them that there's no pressure like public pressure, and no politician doesn't respond to public pressure. But I also want to ask, do you guys, I assume you're not the only group in the country that is pushing for this, and are you coordinating with any other groups that do this?
So we tell people with a mixture of pride and sadness that for quite a long time, and by the way you measure time in Trump presidency years, seems like a long time indeed, we were indeed the only national group calling for impeachment. So we're proud to have done it, but sad that many, many more did not join. That remained the case until the firing of Jim Comey, when a group that was founded many years ago by Howard Dean called Democracy for All came out and called for impeachment on the basis of the obstruction of justice. So we are now two proud national organizations. Others are starting to inch closer to it, but I think that's it right now nationally, and Ron might add to that in a second, but just to answer the other part of the question, yes, we do coordinate with all these groups. You know, we have conversations with groups like Move On and various other groups that we would love to have join in the call for impeachment. We're not as big as a lot of those groups, and we would be perfectly happy to no longer be the big group calling for impeachment. We'd love to have as many big groups as we can join in that call.
I just want to add, I'm not going to name any names of organizations, but there have been some emails that have been forwarded to us that say, you know, sign here to impeach Trump. And what they're using is attempting to fundraise. These are political action committees. You know, we're not trying to use this to advance the election of any particular party or the House of Representatives. We really are actually trying to impeach Trump. And so if you get an email from an organization that says, you know, sign here or donate here to impeach Trump, I would ask, like, what are you actually doing about it? Have you been in contact with the offices of members of both political parties in Congress? Are you doing local organizing in places like Brookline, Massachusetts to help pass pro-impeachment resolutions? Or are you using this as a fundraising basis to help prepare for the 2018 elections? Which, again, it's fine that some organizations want to do that. We're working to reform the money in politics that allows them to legally do that. But just don't be confused if you see an email like that.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to recognize and thank you for your front burner issue of impeaching Trump. And I'm totally on board with that. I do want to ask you to please keep the back burner issue keep the flame up on that, because I feel like right now, to me, it's appalling the lack of outrage coming from Washington, D.C. And I would tend to go along with your bipartisanship, except that there's one party in control right now, and they've been unbelievably silent. And so please, I think that the problems go way deeper than just Trump. He's certainly at the head of the pack, but where is the outrage? You know, how do these people stay silent? And I would encourage you to keep up with the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, and most of all, Citizens United, because clearly the people in this country don't control things anymore.
Thank you, and I encourage you to visit freespeechforpeople.org to see the efforts that we're doing outside of this.
At the risk of sounding partisan, I don't want anyone to be confused that when I emphasize contacting the Democrats in Congress, that I put the blame first on the Democrats. It's quite clear where the blame goes first, and it is the controlling Republican Party who have enabled Donald Trump and are continuing to enable him day by day, and I couldn't agree more with that. And I think we should all be pushing Republicans to find their conscience, if they still have them, their backbone, if they have one, and step up and do the right thing. But for most of us, the first point of access to that is our own Democratic representative. So that's the reason. But agree with everything you said, and as Ron said, we are certainly continuing to work in all those other areas.
I just want to make a quick announcement. I'm Terry Mason again. I said I'm doing some organizing in Boston along with Bruce Shafee up there. So if anyone wants to attend a meeting and get on the mailing list, please let me know before you leave, or let Bruce know so we don't lose you, because we will have a big meeting coming up and you might want to tell all your friends. That's it.
Thank you, Terry.
Just quickly, the constitutional
aspects that you covered were very helpful tonight. But one thing we haven't talked about is mental capacity and irrational behavior. And I wonder if there's any legal precedent to begin to look at some of these issues, particularly when we have a president that's escalating our nuclear capacity and has, unless Senator Markey's bill passes, first strike ability.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And there is, in fact, a legal basis for removing the president due to mental health and otherwise being unfit, which he clearly is, for the office, and that's the 25th Amendment. It allows essentially the vice president or the president's cabinet to notify Congress that the president is unfit to fill the duties of president. And then the president can oppose that, and then it ultimately goes to a decision for Congress, and there's several steps back and forth. If you want to know more about it, look up Keith Olbermann's resistance program. One of his early episodes was all about how the 25th Amendment works. So there is a mechanism. It I think, was passed with the concept of a president literally being unconscious or otherwise unfit. But a number of people, including a conservative columnist in the New York Times today, are now recognizing that this may in fact fit here and this may be a necessary step. You want to add to that?
I'd just say we would accept that as an alternative outcome, although for impeachment.
Impeachment, resignation, 25th Amendment, whatever gets us there. Marguerite Dorn wants to add a message.
Quick message, because I know these guys probably won't. Ben introduced me at the outset, and I have the privilege of sitting on the Board of Free Speech for People. I am amazed on a daily basis at what these guys do. And I think you've had an opportunity tonight to see the really unique combination of extraordinary intellectual grasp of what we're facing and kind of what the response might be with extraordinary level of passion. These guys work so hard. And so I wanted to take an opportunity to make a pitch, because I know that they won't. Free Speech for People could really use whatever anybody feels they could do by way of donation. We could really use some financial support. It's a very small organization. People are working around the clock. So if that's something that you feel that you could do, be very well appreciated.
Thank you, Marguerite. Do we have time for Alex? Yes, of course we do.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind you, if you're a town meeting member and you'd like to speak at town meeting, please see Barbara or me afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming.